Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. You know the drill. We're going to take a topic and really get into it.
Absolutely.
And today's is a really interesting one. It's all about human connection, but not in the way you might immediately think.
That's right. We're going beyond the usual, like talking and texting.
Right, exactly.
Dang.
This is about how our brains might be communicating on a whole other level. And I have to give a huge shout out to you, the listener, because you sent in some research that sparked this whole deep dive.
Yeah, it's a study titled Human Communication and the Electrophysiological Activity of the Brain. Pretty catchy, huh?
Definitely grabbed my attention, and it was done by Jacobo Grinberg, Zilberbaum, and his colleagues.
Published in the journal Subtle Energies.
So, we're getting into some pretty fascinating territory here, and the paper explores this concept of transferred potentials, which basically suggests that there might be a link between the brain activity of two people who are deeply connected.
Yeah, it's like a brain-to-brain connection.
Yeah.
But hold on, before we get too carried away, we got to clarify what these researchers meant by direct communication,
Yeah.
right? Because it's not mind reading like you might see in the movies.
Yeah, good point. So what are we actually talking about here?
Well, they define direct communication as this state of profound nonverbal connection, a heightened awareness of the other person's presence.
Okay, so less about exchanging specific thoughts and more about just feeling deeply tuned in to the other person.
Exactly. And to create this state, you know what they did? They paired up participants and put them in a room together in total darkness and silence for like 20 minutes.
Wow, talk about cutting out all distractions.
Right. It's all about fostering that deep connection. But that's just the setup. The really interesting stuff comes next.
All right, I'm hooked. So what happened after the lights went out?
Well, they separated the pairs into two different rooms, and these rooms were electromagnetically shielded like Faraday cages.
So no way for them to communicate through normal means like sound or light.
Exactly. They were completely isolated. And then one person in each pair was exposed to visual and auditory stimuli like flashes of light and sounds.
Okay, and the other person was just sitting there in the dark?
Yep, in complete sensory deprivation.
That's wild. So how on earth did they measure if this direct communication they established had any effect on brain activity? You can't just feel the vibes.
Of course not. This is science.
Yeah.
You need hard data, and for that, they used EEG electroencephalography.
Right, EEG that measures the electrical activity in the brain.
Exactly. And they were looking for a specific pattern called an evoked potential.
An evoked potential.
It's like an electrical signature that your brain makes in response to a stimulus like those light flashes or sounds.
So the person receiving the stimuli would definitely have an evoked potential show up on their EEG.
Exactly. But here's the million-dollar question. What about the person in the other room, the one sitting in darkness? Were they showing any brain activity that mirrored their partner's evoked potential even though they weren't experiencing anything themselves?
Whoa, wait, so you're saying there's a possibility that the unstimulated person's brain might show a similar pattern to the stimulated person's brain just because of that deep connection they had beforehand?
That's exactly what they were looking for.
Huh?
They called it a transferred potential, like a brainwave echo.
Mind-blowing. Okay, I have to know, did they actually find these transferred potentials?
Well, they had to be really careful to make sure they weren't just seeing random noise.
Right. Of course. How did they do that?
They took multiple averages of the brain activity to make sure it wasn't just a fluke.
So a rigorous process.
And they used statistical correlation analysis to confirm that the transferred potential really matched the evoked potential.
Okay, they were thorough. I'll give them that. So drum roll, please. What were the results?
In a number of cases, they did find these transferred potentials in the unstimulated person. And get this, they closely resembled the evoked potentials of their partners who were receiving the stimuli.
That's incredible. So even though one person was experiencing nothing, their brain was syncing up with their partners simply because of that connection they'd made before.
It seems that way. And it makes you wonder, have you ever just felt like you knew what someone was thinking or feeling without them saying anything?
Oh, all the time. Like there are times when I just feel completely in sync with someone, like we're on the same wavelength. It's really quite something.
It is. And this research might give us some clues as to why that happens. But it's important to remember this is just one study. We need more research to really understand this phenomenon.
For sure, science is a process of building upon what we know. I'm curious, though, what kind of explanations did the researchers offer for these findings? They must have had some theories.
They did. They called it synergic theory, and it's pretty fascinating stuff.
Synergic theory. All right, lay it on me. What's the gist?
Well, in a nutshell, it suggests that our brains generate something called neuronal fields which can interact with each other.
Neuronal fields interacting. Okay, I'm
Yeah.
following so far.
But here's where it gets really wild. These neuronal fields might also be interacting with the very fabric of space-time itself.
Hold up, you're saying our brains might be connected to something bigger than just each other. They might be linked to the universe itself.
That's what this theory proposes, and it could explain how information might be transferred between people on a deeper level than we ever imagined.
This is blowing my mind. I need a minute to process all this.
I hear you. It's a lot to take in, and there's even more to explore.
Well, I'm definitely ready for more. Let's dive deeper into this synergic theory and see where it takes us.
All right, so where were we? Ah, yes, synergic theory. And the idea that our brains might be creating these fields that extend beyond our physical bodies.
It's definitely a lot to wrap your head around. I mean, it sounds almost like science fiction, but then again, so many scientific discoveries started out sounding pretty unbelievable.
Right? Like, think about the first people who proposed that the Earth was round. They probably got some pretty strange looks.
Exactly. So let's try to break down this synergic theory a bit more. You mentioned that these neuronal fields could interact with each other.
Yeah, it's like imagine each of us has this sort of energy field around us generated by our brain activity, and these fields can kind of like overlap and influence each other.
Okay, I'm picturing like those diagrams of magnetic fields you see in physics textbooks.
Yeah, kind of like that. But instead of magnets, we're talking about brains. And the researchers suggest that this interaction between neuronal fields might be the key to understanding how these transferred potentials are happening.
So the idea is that when two people are deeply connected, their neuronal fields are kind of in sync, and that allows for this subconscious communication to take place.
Exactly. And it gets even more mind-boggling when you consider the other aspect of synergy theory, the part about these fields interacting with space-time itself.
That's the part that really stretches my imagination. I mean, we're talking about the fabric of the universe here.
I know, right? It's like something straight out of Star Trek. But the researchers propose that these neuronal fields might not just be limited to interacting with each other. They might actually be able to influence and be influenced by the very structure of reality.
Whoa. Okay, so we're not just talking about brains communicating with brains anymore. We're talking about brains potentially tapping into something much larger, much more fundamental.
That's the suggestion. And it raises all sorts of questions about the nature of consciousness and our place in the cosmos. Are we more interconnected with the universe than we ever realized?
It's definitely a mind-blowing concept, and it makes you wonder about the implications. If our brains can interact with space-time, does that mean we have the potential to influence reality with our thoughts?
It's a fascinating question, and one that we might not have an answer to for a long time, but it's certainly something to ponder.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've done a pretty good job of diving deep into synergic theory. What do you say we shift gears a bit and look at some of the specific experiments the researchers conducted to test these ideas?
Sounds good to me. There's one experiment in particular, experiment 3, that really stands out because it introduces this concept of a hyperfield.
A hyperfield. All right, you've definitely got my attention. Tell me more.
Well, in the previous experiments, they had been working with pairs of participants, right? But in experiment 3, they decided to up the ante and have multiple people on the sending side.
So instead of just one person experiencing the stimuli, they had a whole group.
Exactly. They had 4 people establish direct communication together in one room, and then 3 of them went into that second shielded room, the one with the light flashes, while the 4th person stayed behind in the first room.
Okay, so this time it's like a 3-to-1 connection, 3 people sending and 1 person receiving. What were they hoping to find with this setup?
They wanted to see if having multiple people experiencing the same stimuli would amplify the transfer potential in the person who was sitting alone in the dark.
So it's like they were trying to create a stronger signal by having more brains involved.
Exactly, and the results were pretty striking. They found a much clearer transferred potential in the person who was alone, even stronger than when they had just one sender.
Wow, so it seems like the combined energy of those 3 sending brains really did have an impact on the receiver's brain activity.
It certainly seems that way, and this led the researchers to propose the idea of the hyperfield, this collective field of consciousness that connects us all.
Okay, I have to admit, this hyperfield concept is kind of blowing my mind. So if I'm understanding correctly, it's like we're all part of this vast interconnected web of consciousness, and our individual thoughts and emotions are constantly feeding into it and being influenced by it.
That's a pretty good summary. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
like Imagine a giant ocean of consciousness, and we're all little drops in that ocean constantly interacting and influencing each other.
It makes you wonder about the implications. If we're all connected through this hyperfield, does that mean our actions have a greater ripple effect than we realize? Could our individual choices be impacting the collective consciousness in ways we don't even understand?
It's definitely something to consider, and it brings up a lot of questions about responsibility and the power of our intentions. If we're all part of this interconnected web, then maybe we need to be more mindful of the thoughts and emotions we're putting out into the world.
It's a profound thought, and it makes this research feel even more significant.
Hmm.
It's not just about understanding some obscure scientific phenomenon, it's about understanding ourselves and our place in the universe.
I completely agree, and I think that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. It's not just about the science, it's about what the science tells us about who we are and how we connect with each other and the world around us.
Well said. And speaking of connecting with each other, I'm curious to get your take on how this research might relate to those moments in life when you feel an inexplicable connection with someone. Like you just know what they're thinking or feeling without them saying a word.
It's funny you should mention that because as we've been talking about all this, I've been having those same thoughts. You know, is it possible that those moments of deep connection are somehow tapping into this hyperfield or this idea of transferred potentials?
It's a tantalizing possibility, right? Like maybe those moments when we feel most in tune with someone aren't just flukes, maybe they're glimpses into a deeper level of connection that we're not always aware of.
It's definitely a thought-provoking idea and one that I think deserves further exploration, but I think we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's bring it back to the research for a moment.
Right, you're right. We need to stay grounded in the data. So let's take a closer look at what the researchers actually found in their experiments.
One of the things that really jumped out at me was figure 1 in the paper.
Oh, yeah, I remember seeing that. What was it about that figure that caught your eye?
It provides a really clear visual comparison between a session where the participants had achieved direct communication and a control session where they hadn't.
I'm with you. Sometimes those visuals can be so helpful in understanding complex data. What did you notice in this particular figure?
Well, if you look closely at the brain activity of the unstimulated person in the direct communication session, you see this distinct peak happening at roughly the same time as the peak in the stimulated person's brain activity.
Oh, yeah, I see it now. It's like their brain waves are mirroring each other, even though only one of them is actually experiencing the stimulus.
Exactly. And in the control session, there's no such corresponding peak. It's relatively flat.
That's a really powerful visual representation of the transferred potential concept. It really drives home the point that this isn't just some random occurrence.
Precisely. It seems to be directly linked to that state of deep connection that the participants cultivated beforehand.
It's pretty wild to think that just by being connected in this way, one person's brain activity can influence another's, even when they're physically isolated and one has no idea what the other's
I
experiencing.
know it's like a form of subconscious communication that we're only just beginning to understand.
It makes you wonder what other secrets the brain is hiding, right? Like what other incredible abilities might we discover if we keep digging deeper?
Absolutely.
Oui.
The human brain is still largely a mystery, and I have a feeling we're just scratching the surface of what it's capable of.
So they had this group of four all connected, and then what happened next?
3 of the participants went into that second shielded room, the one that blocks all those external signals, and the fourth person stayed in the first room. But here's the difference. This time, all 3 people in that second room were exposed to the light flashes.
Okay, so three senders and one receiver sitting alone in the dark.
Exactly. And the person in the first room had no idea what the others were experiencing.
Gotcha. So what was the point of changing the setup like that?
They wanted to see if increasing the number of senders would have any effect on the strength of that transfer potential in the receiver.
Ah, I see. So if three brains were sending out those signals, would it create a stronger echo in the brain of the person who wasn't experiencing the lights directly?
That was the idea. And the results were pretty fascinating. They found a really clear and strong transferred potential in the person who was alone, even stronger than what they saw in the previous experiments with just one sender.
So it seems like having more people on the sending side really did amplify the signal.
It does.
Okay.
And this is what led them to propose the idea of a hyperfield this collective field of consciousness that connects us all.
Okay, this hyperfield concept is pretty mind-blowing. So to make sure I'm understanding this correctly, you're saying that we're not just individuals with separate minds, but we're all connected through this larger field of consciousness.
That's the idea. It's like imagining a giant ocean of consciousness, and we're all like drops in that ocean, constantly interacting and influencing each other.
Wow, that's a really powerful image, and it makes you think about the implications, right? Like if we're all connected in this way, maybe our actions have a much greater impact than we realize.
It certainly raises some interesting questions about responsibility and interconnectedness. Like, if our thoughts and emotions are constantly feeding into this hyperfield, maybe we need to be more mindful of what we're putting out there.
It's almost like we have a responsibility to cultivate positive thoughts and emotions, not just for our own well-being, but for the well-being of the entire collective.
It's a beautiful thought,
Mm.
and it aligns with a lot of spiritual traditions that emphasize the interconnectedness of all things.
It really makes you think about the power of our intentions, right? Like if we can influence this hyperfield with our thoughts and emotions, maybe we have more power to shape our reality than we realize.
That's a question that has fascinated philosophers and scientists for centuries, and this research might give us some new insights into how that might actually work.
This whole deep dive has been incredible. It's really challenged me to expand my thinking about what's possible and how we connect with each other and the world around us.
Me too.
Oh,
It's definitely one of those topics that leaves you with more questions than answers,
yeah.
but that's what makes it so intriguing.
Absolutely. Well, I want to give a huge thank you to you, the listener, for sending in this research. It's been an absolute pleasure diving into it with you.
And if you're as fascinated by this topic as we are, be sure to check out the show notes for a link to the original paper.
We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to reach out to us on our website or social media.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep your minds open to the infinite possibilities within and around us.
This is The Deep Dive signing off.